Hello and welcome to another session of Mindful Data Mine. In today's session, we will be discussing about how we can create macro variable using do loop. As we have already discussed about loops in our previous session. So this is an extension to the loops, and here we will be talking about how we can create a macro variable using do loop. So the syntax for the do loop will remain same, but there is a difference between the loops and creating a macro variable. For that, we just need to add a percent symbol with that. So without wasting any further time, let's start with the practical. So the basic syntax for writing do loop is do I equals to, let's say, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and we write end in the end. That tells us that okay, my do loop will end at this particular position, that is on row number or line number 8. Okay, whatever is written in between the loop on 6th and 7th line will be repeated 3 times because 2 is set to 3. Now to create a macro variable using do loop, we pass percent do and percent %2. Similarly, this will be percent %n. Now this will be a macrotized loop. That means the value of I, here I will become a macro variable. Okay, so if we try to print an percent %I, this will be 1, 2, 3. Okay, and one thing that you need to keep in mind, we cannot run a loop like this. When I say a loop, here I am talking about a macrotized loop. For that, it should be inside a macro. Okay, so now the general syntax for writing a do loop for creating macro variable will be macro, let's say mm1. Inside this we can have our loop, and finally we need to close the macro using mn, and to run a macro it will be percent %mm1. So this will become the general syntax for writing a do loop which can create macro variables. Okay, now let's see an example, and then using that example we will see how we can utilize the do loop to create different data sets. So for this example, what I'll do is I'll first create a data set A, and I'll use SAS help.cars. Okay, I'll run it. Now let's check the results. Okay, so we have 15 columns and 428 rows in SAS help.cars. Okay, if you see the drivetrain, we have all front, rear. These are the three drivetrains. And let's assume that we have a requirement that we need to segregate the data by drivetrain. That means we need three different data set, all front and rear. In data set all, we need to have all the records which are related to drivetrain all. Similarly for front and rear. Okay, so how we can do it? What I'll do is first I'll create a macro variable, let's say dt, in which I'll write the three values all, then REAR is for rear, FRONT is for front. Okay, now since my requirement says that I need to create three different data set, all, rear and front. Okay, therefore what I'll do is I need to create a data set. I'll write data and dt. Okay, now if you remember from our previous session, if I pass dt like this, what I'll get all comma rear comma front written over here. That means this will be replaced by this particular thing, right? But since our requirement says we need one data set for all, one for rear and one for front, that is why what we need to do is we first need to extract the first record, followed by second and then the third record. Okay, since so because there are only three records, that's why we need to run a loop three times. That's why I have this I equals to 1, 2, 3. Okay, now inside this again we'll create a macro variable which will hold the first record, then second record, and then third record. Okay, we need to get the first, second, and third record inside the loop. For this, let's say I'm creating a new macro named as DTNM for date drivetrain name, and here I'll use %scan. So this %scan is mainly used for macro variables. This is same as scan function which we have seen earlier in our previous session. Here we need to pass first the macro variable from which we want to take the data. So it will be an dt. Next, if you remember from scan, we need to pass the particular chunk that we need to fetch. When I talk about chunk, this is my first chunk, this is second, and this is third. Okay, for that we have this I equals to 1, 2, 3. Okay, so when the I is at first position, I'll get the first chunk. When it is on second position, I'll get the second chunk. And when it is on third, I'll get the third chunk. Okay, so I'll write ampersand I because this is a macrotized variable, and third will be comma because this is separated by a comma. Okay, now I'll simply put a semicolon, and now I have this dt name in which I'll get the three records. Okay, now let's write our data step. So data dtnm. So dtnm because we'll get all here first time, then rear, then front. We need the data from SAS help.cars, or we can even bring it from A because this is our temporary data set in which we have SAS help.cars data. Third is where. We can also use if. If you have seen the previous sessions, you know the difference between if and where and when to use where. Okay, I'll use low case strip, and here I'll need to pass drivetrain equals to, inside double quotes I need to pass DTNM. Okay, and finally we need to write run. Now let's run this and check whether it will run, or will we get anything, any error or any warning or any notes. Okay, so we got an error. Let's read what it says. The macro function %scan has too many variables, too many arguments, sorry. Why do you think it says so? Okay, let's go back to the code. So if you see this comma, this is separated by comma. And in the scan function, when we need to separate anything, we use comma. So what happens here is when our and dt replace it to like this. So scan is reading this as the first argument, then the second argument, then this is third argument, fourth, and this is fifth. The general requirement for scan function is three arguments. First is the string, second is the chunk, and the third is the separator by which we are separating the chunks. Okay, that is why we are getting that error. So in case if you want to avoid it, there are two ways. Okay, first what we can do is we can simply use maybe some other special character like this. I'm using pipe now, and I can replace it with pipe. And now if I run it, then I'll get three data sets, all, front, and rear. Okay. And in case if we want to keep comma, okay, then in that case we need to use another function named as nr code. Okay, so it masks the special character and mnemonic operators. So if I use nr code and rerun it, I'll get the same result. So this is how we can create a macro variable using do loop. Please let me know in comment section if you have any questions or queries regarding how we can create macros using do loop. I'll see you in the next session. Thank you.